Welcome to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. Today we continue to talk about World War II, the ending phase of the World War II, and the main focus today is called Towards the Cold War. So the main focus today we're going to discuss what is specific goals and expectations the great powers had at the end of World War II. So last video was devoted to the conference in Yalta, where Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin met and outlined major structures of world politics, such as the United Nations, the Security Council, the Polish borders, which was a big deal, Polish government, denazification, demilitarization of Germany. They made all kinds of agreements we discussed last time. But today I'd like to focus much more on actually what the perceptions were of the great powers of each other and what they actually wanted to achieve, and the kind of a system to create, bypassing the official proclamation and bypassing the propaganda. What were their actual goals in Germany and in Europe as they faced the end of the war? Now, Germany, I mentioned, was supposed to be unconditional surrender. In other words, Germany loses its sovereignty. There's not going to be any sovereignty at all. It would be occupied until further notice. In other words, not that it wouldn't be invited to negotiations as was in World War I. It was much worse. Germany will not have a sovereign nation until further notice, until it is restored. So that's pretty much unconditional surrender. Now, what also is not known is the so-called enforcement plans. The British were very upset about the loss of control over Poland and the fact that Stalin would not allow the London government in exile to get back. And there was this discussion in Britain, which is totally not known in Western history books, which is called enforcement plans. Basically, Churchill was trying to get the Americans to do the enforcement, which means to force Stalin into accepting Western plans for Poland rather than the Soviet ones, which could have led to a military confrontation between Britain and US troops with the Russian ones. But fortunately, the Americans wouldn't allow it, because the Americans really wanted Soviet participation in the war against Japan. Don't forget that the war in Japan was still raging on, and there was not yet any nuclear weapons. They haven't been finished yet. Nobody knew whether they would be effective. In other words, America needed the Russians to fight the Japanese army in China, which was a huge army, Kwantung army, and the Soviets did fight against them, and it was a crucial contribution to victory over Japan. So because the Americans wanted a commitment from Stalin to join the war in Japan, and Stalin agreed to that, and he fulfilled his promise. The promise was that the Soviet Union would join the war against Japan 3 months after capitulation of Germany, and they did. So now the final part, which is who wanted what in the spring of 1945 among the great powers. Now, we'll start with the British. The British were under Churchill. Their policy would change under the Labour government, but under Churchill, the British were really afraid of the Soviet domination of Europe. The British traditional policy was that no continental power should dominate anything. And therefore, the British were to keep Germany disunited and weak, and to prevent Soviet domination of Europe. So that was their policy, which was formulated much later with the creation of NATO, a great formula that the British created to keep Germany down, Russia out, and the United States in. So very precise and concise formulation of British foreign policy. The French were the weakest of the four great powers. They just basically were barely recovering their national sovereignty. And the only thing the French were worried about is Germany. and they wanted to make sure in any agreement that Germany would be weak, that would not pose any threat to France. And they were not opposed at all to dismembering Germany and creating 2 or 3 states out of it, as the American Morgenthau plan called for. So you already have two powers that want to dismember Germany, two Western powers. And the British wouldn't mind that either, because they don't want any strong country dominate continental Europe. So you actually have a serious danger to German unitary state from the Western powers, not from the Soviet Union, as most people would like to think. And it was Stalin who insisted Germany should be one unified state, but denazified, demilitarized, and with prohibitions on armed forces. Now, about the Americans. The American goals in spring of 45 were basically three, and I will identify them as such. Number one direction was Wilsonian, which means to create a stable peace order in the tradition of Woodrow Wilson, with League of Nations, the United Nations, the Security Council, the institutions that would keep peace, number one. Number two, they were very much anti-militarist and anti-Nazi. So in that sense, the position of Roosevelt was very close to the Soviet one, in that wholehearted denazification, demilitarization, including possible dismemberment of Germany, which, as I said, the Russians didn't want. And the third direction of American policy was capitalist, as I call it, which is basically to use economic might of Germany for the benefit of the United States, which they did eventually by getting all kinds of technologies from the Germans, by taking over Opel, that to the present day remains GM, and so on. So it is kind of capitalist, meaning economic dimension of dominating Germany, which the US did successfully, at least in the next 20, 30 years after the war. And finally, the Soviet objectives, goals in the spring of 1945. The Soviet objectives were basically the paramount overall objective was to prevent Germany from ever being strong enough to attack the Soviet Union. So from that point of view, denazification and demilitarization was very important. Number two, it was to punish them with territorial loss, which of course they did by annexing East Prussia and giving another third to Poland. By the way, the Poles got more than the Soviet Union in terms of German territory, even though they didn't really fight, but they got more territory. And the final next element and the last was to install friendly regimes on Russian borders, which would be pretty much the cause of the Cold War. And from the point of view of the Russians, it was natural which the victorious power deserves. You don't have hostile powers on your borders. And all these countries that used to be Germany's allies, such as Hungary and Romania and Finland, and all the others, they basically had to, Bulgaria, de facto ally, they would have to shape up, pro-Russian governments, if need be by force, which is understandable. That's the United States acted exactly the same way in Latin America. Just kick out these governments that are communist or leftist and install the friendly ones. So from the Stalin's point of view, it was natural. Russia was winning the war, the Soviet Union, and it had to have secure borders, which means friendly governments on its borders. And that, of course, was totally not to the liking of Mr. Churchill and to the Americans, and that would be the cause of the Cold War. Thank you.